The saloon doors swung open with a crash that silenced every conversation in the room. Jack Sullivan stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out the afternoon sun, casting a long shadow across the sawdust-covered floor. At 35, he was the most successful rancher in 3 counties, a man whose word was law and whose pride was legendary. He had everything, land, cattle, respect, everything except a wife. And that, according to his drunken friends gathered around the poker table, was about to change in the most humiliating way possible. "You're really going through with this?" Tom Henderson asked, dealing cards with hands that trembled slightly from too much whiskey. "Choosing a bride based on a bet." Jack's jaw tightened as he remembered the foolish wager he'd made just hours before. In his arrogance, he'd claimed he could make any woman fall in love with him within a year, that love was nothing more than compatibility and effort. His friends had laughed, and in the heat of the moment, with pride burning in his chest, he'd agreed to let them choose his bride. The only condition, she had to be a widow from the town, someone respectable enough that the marriage wouldn't be a complete scandal. They'd chosen Clara Bennett. The name had sobered him instantly. Clara was the town's most mysterious figure, a woman who'd arrived 5 years ago wearing black mourning clothes she never seemed to shed. She lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, taking in sewing and mending to survive. People whispered about her, some said her husband had been a criminal, others claimed she was hiding from a dark past. She never attended social gatherings, never smiled, never let anyone close enough to know the truth. And she was beautiful in a way that made Jack's chest ache, not the obvious beauty of the saloon girls or the practiced charm of the society ladies who tried to catch his attention. Clara's beauty was quiet, almost severe, like a winter landscape that took your breath away with its stark honesty. Now, standing outside her cottage 3 days after the bet, Jack wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The small house was neat but bare, with a tiny garden struggling against the harsh Montana soil. He knocked, and the sound seemed too loud, too aggressive in the peaceful afternoon. The door opened slowly, and Clara stood before him, her dark eyes guarded and searching. She wore a simple gray dress that had been mended so many times it was more patched than original fabric. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that might have been soft once but had been hardened by grief into something unreadable. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice low and careful. "I wasn't expecting you." "Mrs. Bennett." He removed his hat, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy instead of one of the most powerful men in the territory. "I have a proposition for you." He'd rehearsed this speech a dozen times, had planned to be straightforward and businesslike. Instead, standing before her, seeing the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow from life, the words tumbled out all wrong. "I need a wife," he said bluntly. "And you need security. I'm offering a marriage of convenience. You'll have a home, comfort, everything you need. I won't make demands on you beyond keeping house and appearing at my side when necessary. In 1 year, if you're unhappy, I'll grant you a divorce and enough money to start over anywhere you choose." Clara's expression didn't change, but he saw her fingers tighten on the doorframe. "Why me?" The honest answer, because of a drunken bet, would have ended the conversation. So Jack told her a different truth, one he'd only realized standing there. "Because you're the only woman in this town who doesn't want anything from me. Everyone else sees my money, my ranch, my position. You see a man interrupting your afternoon. That's worth something." For a long moment, Clara studied him, and Jack had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through his carefully constructed walls to the lonely, prideful man underneath. "I accept," she said finally. "But I have conditions." They were married the following week in a small ceremony that shocked the entire town. Jack's friends watched with barely concealed amusement, already planning to collect their winnings when the marriage inevitably failed. The society ladies whispered behind their fans about how the mighty Jack Sullivan had been trapped by a fortune-hunting widow. The men at the saloon made crude jokes about the wedding night. But there was no wedding night, not in the way anyone imagined. Clara moved into Jack's sprawling ranch house with a single trunk of belongings. He'd given her the largest bedroom, the one with windows overlooking the valley where his cattle grazed in the distance. His own room was at the opposite end of the hall, an arrangement that suited them both, or so he told himself. The first month was awkward, filled with careful politeness and the sound of their footsteps echoing in rooms too large and too empty. Clara kept house with quiet efficiency, but she remained closed off, a ghost moving through his life without ever really touching it. She wore her widow's clothes like armor, spoke in careful, measured sentences, and never, ever let her guard down. Jack threw himself into ranch work, riding out before dawn and returning after dark, telling himself he was giving her space when really he was hiding from the uncomfortable realization that he'd brought a stranger into his home and called her his wife. It was Maria, his longtime housekeeper, who finally confronted him. "You're a fool, Jack Sullivan," she said one evening, cornering him in the kitchen. Maria had known him since he was a boy, had worked for his parents, and was one of the few people who could speak to him without fear. "That girl is drowning in this big house, and you're running away like a coward." "I'm giving her what she needs," Jack protested. "Security, comfort." "She needs to be seen," Maria interrupted, her dark eyes flashing. "She needs someone to care whether she's happy or sad, whether she ate dinner or sat alone in the dark." "You think giving her a fancy room makes you a good man? You're worse than a stranger, you're a husband who treats her like a piece of furniture." The words stung because they were true. That night, Jack knocked on Clara's door for the first time. She opened it wearing a nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. Without the severe style and dark colors, she looked younger, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly sad. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Do you play chess?" The question surprised them both. Clara blinked. Yes. My father taught me when I was young." "Good. Tomorrow evening, after dinner, would you play with me?" Something flickered in her eyes, suspicion, hope, confusion, before the mask came back down. "If you wish." That chess game changed everything. They sat across from each other in the library, the board between them, and for the first time, they actually looked at each other. Clara played with a fierce intelligence that surprised Jack, her moves calculated and bold. She won the first game, and when he complimented her strategy, she smiled, actually smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "You let me win," she accused, but there was warmth in her voice. "I absolutely did not," Jack replied, setting up the pieces for another game. "You destroyed my defense. I'm just impressed you didn't gloat." "The night is young," Clara said, and this time her smile reached her eyes. They began playing every evening, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about anything deep at first, just observations about the ranch, comments about the changing weather, small jokes that made Clara's smile appear more frequently. Jack found himself rushing through his work to get home for their evening games, found himself listening for her footsteps in the house, noticing when she seemed tired or when something had made her happy. 6 weeks into their marriage, Jack came home to find Clara in his study, tears streaming down her face as she held a letter in trembling hands. Every instinct told him to retreat, to give her privacy, but Maria's words echoed in his mind. "She needs to be seen." "Clara?" He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. "What's wrong?" She tried to hide the letter, to wipe away her tears, but he gently took her hand. "Please," he said. "Let me help." "You can't," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. "It's from my late husband's family. They've found me again. They want money. They're threatening to come here, to tell everyone about." "About what?" Clara's face crumbled, and suddenly she was talking, the words pouring out like a dam had broken. She told him about her marriage to Thomas Bennett, a charming man who'd swept her off her feet when she was barely 18. How the charm had hidden a gambling addiction and mounting debts. How he'd borrowed money from dangerous people, making promises he never intended to keep. How he died in a fight outside a saloon, leaving her with nothing but his debts and his family's accusations that she'd somehow been responsible. They took everything, Clara said. The confrontation with Thomas Bennett's family came 2 weeks later. They arrived at the ranch unannounced, Thomas's brother, Martin, and their mother, a bitter woman whose face was twisted with resentment and greed. Jack met them at the door, Clara standing slightly behind him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We've come for what we're owed," Martin announced, his eyes sweeping over the ranch house with naked greed. "Clara married up, didn't she? Landed herself a rich rancher. We figure she owes us for taking care of her after Thomas died." "You took everything she had," Jack said coldly. "You bled her dry and then blamed her for your brother's failures. You have no claim here." Mrs. Bennett's lip curled. "She's a whore who drove my son to his grave. Everyone should know what kind of woman you've married." Jack's fist clenched, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. For the first time since he'd known her, she wasn't hiding, wasn't making herself small. She stood tall, her voice steady and clear. "Thomas was an alcoholic and a gambling addict," she said. "I loved him, and I tried to help him, but I couldn't save him from himself. I was 18 years old and terrified, and you made me feel like his death was my fault. You took everything from me, my home, my dignity, my ability to trust anyone. But you couldn't take who I really am." She turned to look at Jack, and the love in her eyes made his heart stop. "This man chose me when he had no reason to. He's shown me more kindness in 3 months than I experienced in 3 years of marriage to your son. And I'm done being ashamed of things I didn't do. We'll tell everyone," Martin threatened. "We'll ruin your reputation." "Go ahead," Jack said, wrapping his arm around Clara's waist. "Tell whoever you want. The truth is, I chose Clara not despite her past, but because of the strength it took to survive it. Now get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing and extortion." He watched them leave, their empty threats dying on their lips as they realized they had no power here. When their wagon disappeared down the road, Clara turned in his arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You called me strong," she whispered. "You are," Jack said. "You're the strongest person I know." That night, Clara came to Jack's room for the first time. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in her nightgown, looking more terrified than she had facing her tormentors. "I need to show you something," she said. "Something I've been too ashamed to reveal. It's why I've kept my distance, why I've worn these heavy clothes even in summer. If you're going to truly know me, you need to see." Jack's heart pounded as Clara's hands went to the ties of her nightgown. For a moment, he thought he understood. Perhaps she bore scars from her first marriage, evidence of abuse she'd been too ashamed to share. He braced himself, ready to reassure her that nothing could change how he felt. But when the fabric fell away, revealing her body in the lamplight, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Clara's torso was covered in burned scars, not fresh, but old and silvered with time. They spread across her stomach and chest in terrible patterns that spoke of unimaginable pain. But it wasn't just the scars that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. Clara's body, beneath the scarring, told a different story. She'd been malnourished for so long that her ribs showed, her hip bones jutted sharply, her collarbones were harsh lines against too thin shoulders. "The night Thomas died," Clara said, her voice shaking but determined, "he'd been drinking. He knocked over a lamp. Our cottage caught fire. I tried to save him, but he was unconscious from the alcohol. I got burned pulling him out, but it was too late. He died from smoke inhalation before the doctor arrived. And his family blamed me, said I'd started the fire deliberately." She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. "After they took everything, I had nothing. For 2 years, I barely ate. I took whatever work I could find, slept in abandoned buildings, survived on scraps. By the time I made it to this town, I was more ghost than woman. The widow's clothes weren't just for mourning, they were to hide what I'd become." Jack couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his heart breaking for this woman who'd endured so much and somehow remained kind, remained human, remained capable of smiling over a chessboard and making his empty house feel like a home. "I understand if you want to end this," Clara continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. "I know I'm not what you expected. I'm damaged, broken. Stop." Jack closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her gently into his arms, careful of her scars. "You're not broken. You're a survivor. You're a warrior. And you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." "How can you say that?" Clara sobbed against his chest. "Look at me." "I am looking at you," Jack said, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "I'm looking at a woman who saved her husband's life even though he'd never saved hers. I'm looking at someone who survived 2 years of hell and came out the other side still capable of kindness. I'm looking at the person I've been falling in love with since the moment you beat me at chess. You love me." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "I love you," Jack confirmed, and saying it out loud made him realize how deeply, how completely it was true. "I love your strength, your intelligence, your terrible poker face when you're planning your next chess move. I love the way you've made this house a home. I love that you're brave enough to show me your scars." He pulled back slightly, unbuttoning his own shirt. "I have scars too," he said, showing her the evidence of his own past, a jagged line across his ribs from a cattle stampede, burn marks on his arm from branding irons, the rough hands of a man who'd worked hard every day of his life. "We all carry our wounds. But yours don't define you, Clara. Your kindness defines you. Your courage defines you. The way you got up every morning and chose to keep living, that defines you." Clara's fingers traced the scar on his ribs, her touch gentle and wondering. "I never thought anyone would see me this way," she admitted. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life hiding." "No more hiding," Jack said, cupping her face in his hands. "No more shame. You're my wife, Clara Sullivan. Not because of a bet or a business arrangement, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." They spent that night talking, really talking, sharing every painful memory and secret hope they'd kept locked away. Jack told her about the loneliness of inheriting his father's ranch, the pressure to be strong and successful while feeling empty inside. Clara told him about her childhood dreams of being a teacher, the books she'd had to sell when Thomas's debts mounted, the guilt she'd carried for being unable to save him. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jack and Clara fell asleep in each other's arms, not as strangers bound by a contract, but as 2 people who'd found home in each other's broken places. The year of their agreement came and went. Jack never mentioned the divorce clause, and Clara never asked about it. Instead, they built a life together that was richer than either had imagined possible. Clara slowly gained weight, her body healing with proper food and care. She began teaching reading and arithmetic to the ranch hands' children, fulfilling the dream she'd thought was lost forever. Jack found himself laughing more, his pride softening into something warmer and more genuine. 5 years after their wedding, Clara stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching Jack play with their 3-year-old daughter, Emma. The little girl had her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubborn chin, and she was demanding another horsey ride with the imperious authority only a toddler could command. "Again, Daddy. Again." Jack caught Clara's eye and grinned, that boyish smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Your mother thinks I'm going to throw out my back," he said, hoisting Emma onto his shoulders anyway. "Your mother is wise," Clara replied, but she was smiling too. That evening, after Emma was asleep, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. Clara leaned against Jack's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist. "Do you ever think about that bet?" she asked. "The way this all started?" Jack was quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. "I think about it all the time. About what a fool I was, thinking I could make someone love me through sheer willpower. About how I almost missed this because of pride and stupidity. I'm glad you were prideful and stupid that day, Clara said. Otherwise, you never would have knocked on my door. Best bet I ever made, Jack agreed. Even if I lost it.